Church, Martin, Thompson, Ernest, Mikus, and Blair. So regular consistent exercise helps to alleviate the obesity epidemic. May not eliminate it 100%, but it helps. So a single hour or greater is considering ideal for weight prevention, weight gain prevention, inhibiting weight gain, and promoting weight loss in the future. So they've had these previous studies for half a year or 25 weeks in the past, and they achieved modest weight loss of 30% of predicted. So they're trying to create a more effective intervention for weight loss that's higher than 30%. So the subtractive difference between actual and predicted weight loss is defined as compensation, a key prodigious word here. Compensation, difference between actual and predicted weight loss. And general basic health, you'd want to engage in 30 minutes or half an hour exercise a day, brain function, heartbeat, lung, breathing. However, the weight loss potential would double that from 30 to 60 minutes for an hour a day. So they have this acronym abbreviation, dose response to exercise in postmenopausal women. And the National Institute of Health had these physical activity recommendations, and they analyzed 50, 100%, and 150% of these recommendations. And they recruited women who were sedentary, obese, or overweight, either one, and postmenopausal if they experience high blood pressure. So they retained women at a rate of 92%, and the people who actually engaged in the exercise training program was measured at 97%. So they had a randomized dose-response exercise trial for the dear women, and these three groups had exercise expenditure in calories measured in terms of energy. They measured these three groups, and they contacted women through the telephone through screening assessments at a rate of 4,545 people or women, and they scheduled this time period between April 2001 and June of 2005. So recruitment ultimately measured 464 postmenopausal sedentary women who were measured between the ages of 45 and 75 years old, middle to elderly ages. And to be sedentary, they engage in exercise of 20 minutes per day or 3 days per week or less, so if they didn't do anything, but this is considered minimal. And they measured leg steps at 8,000 per day for a week for these sedentary women, postmenopausal. And they would generate and exert a heart rate equivalent to 50% of their VO2 max, which is ideal for fat burning, or 55 to 72% of VO2 max, but it's pretty close. And they engaged in the sport cycle ergometer test, the load Excalibur sport cycle ergometry. So their power originally started at 30 watts for 2 minutes, and increased to 50 watts of power for 4 minutes, and then decreased to 20 watts in 2 minutes, or when the women actually failed to exert pedal revolutions at 50 per minute, 50 revolutions, 50 RPM per minute. So when they failed, they eventually just stopped, even though the power was only exerted at 20 watts. So for recruitment, their blood pressure had to be prehypertensive or hypertensive in the systolic range of 120 to 159.9 millimeters of mercury, and they are randomized to 4 groups. One of them is a control. Now, exclusion criteria included stroke, heart attack, or grievous medical problems, and the control group had to comply with sustaining baseline activity for 6 months. So they had an activity level and dietary habits, but they didn't really engage in the exercise training program, so they were different, but because they're a control group. So monthly medical symptoms, they had a questionnaire to determine those. And here's just a flow chart showing the 4 groups. You have a control group, a energy expenditure group of 4 kilocalorie per kilogram per week, 8 kilocalorie per kilogram per week, and then 12 kilocalorie per kilogram per week. So you have these 4 groups. And they have prescribed energy expenditure, again, 4, 8, and 12 kilocalorie per kilogram of body weight per week. So that's what they were expending or oxidizing or burning. And exercise was synchronized as 3 to 4 sessions per week for 6 months, or about 24 weeks in duration. And they had a very strict, accurate, stringent exercise laboratory in which they were measuring the exercise. And then the adherence, exercise compliance, was measured as real actual calorie expenditure over the prescribed predicted calorie expenditure that was designed theoretically. So it's actual over prescribed, and then multiplied by 100. And this is just during the exercise training period. They don't go beyond that 6-month period, extend beyond. So they have this Parvomedics TrueMax 2400 metabolic measurements lab cart analyzing respiratory gases like volume of oxygen, carbon dioxide, and respiratory exchange ratio. And then at 15-second intervals, they measured the average and then calibrated the volume. And an electrocardiogram ECG measured the heart rate. So they had RPE, rating of perceived exertion, from 0 to 20 Borg scale. And the adipose body fat was measured at 4 strategic locations: tricep brachii muscles on the arm, the abdominal core on the torso, the iliac crest of the pelvis and the hip, and then the thigh of the femur. So they measured skin folds. And they had measured calories. Instead of the 3,500 kilocalories per pound, they measured the 7,700 kilocalories per kilogram, which I hadn't seen that number before, but now I know what it is. And they had a mandatory required 19 weeks of recorded legitimate data for individual body weight. And 3 women weren't able to comply with this, even though the actual time frame was 24 weeks, but they only needed 19. 3 women couldn't even do it. They missed their records. And so 427 of the 464 women were involved in the repercussion follow-ups, and so you have 92% of DREER women who actually survived the program. And then the adherence for 13 of the women was less than 85%. And then participants having approved data, 88.6, or 411 DREER women having completing weight and energy data. The average age was measured at 57.2 years, so you had upper middle-aged women, and then the BMI was measured at 31.7 for an inception of the obese level. White Caucasian race was measured at 63.5% of DREER women. And then here's a table showing the I just want to emphasize the body mass index: 31.7, 32.2, 31.4, 32.2, and 31.1 kilograms per meter squared. So it's in the obese range. It's not in the teens or 20s. And adherence: 99.5, 99.3, and 99.2 for each of the energy expenditure groups of 4, 8, and 12 kilocalorie per kilogram of body weight per week. And then the mean steps per day were measured at 4,858 for all DREER women. And here you can see the graphs pretty much look similar. It's just in the 12 kilocalorie per kilogram per week group, they actually had less weight loss. And you can see again in the 12 kilocalorie per kilogram per week group, the 12 group, they only achieved half of the weight loss, where in the 4 and 8 groups, they exceeded the predicted. And then again, you can see how the 12 kilocalorie per kilogram per week group had a higher compensation, which is bad, it's negative, and then prevalence of compensation higher for the 12 group, that's bad. And then percent of predicted weight loss, only half, 53.5 in the 12 kilocalorie per kilogram per week group. And in this graph, you can see in the 12 group, the 12 kilocalorie per kilogram per week group, you had the actual weight losses weren't as low, or I should say not as substantial for the 12 group, because the actual is higher up than the predicted curve. The predictive curve is much lower in weight change, and the actual is higher up. So those squares or dots should be under the predicted line, like in the 4 and 8 group. And again, similarities here. You have no adjustment, and then adjustment for change in weight. So change in waist circumference. You might have a change in waist circumference, but it was similar for the 3 groups, pretty similar. And then, so what this is showing for change in waist circumference, the weight compensation, if you don't have the weight compensation, you have a much greater waist circumference, like a -4 centimeters, which is good. So without the compensation, you lose more waist circumference. However, with the weight loss, when you have the weight loss, then you also have a change in waist circumference. So that's good also. So you can see that. And then, so compensation again is the subtraction difference between actual real-life calorie expenditure that's oxidized and burned, and the prescribed predicted design calorie expenditure in theory. So it's actual minus prescribed. And it increases with dose of exercise. So as the exercise gets more arduous, harder, challenging, and difficult, then the compensation increases. And then that shows that they have trouble losing weight. And the Drew women who exercise lost twice or double the waist circumference of women exercise who failed to lose weight. So you would lose more waist circumference or double twice than women who fail to lose weight if you exercise. So you have to exercise to lose the waist circumference. And inordinate abdominal obesity, which is an epidemic problem we have, contributes to diabetes, cardiovascular disease, mortality, insulin resistance, metabolic syndrome, and mortality. So you have positive health advantages and benefits by engaging in physical activity, even though body weight may not be decreased. So you could have the same body weight, engage in exercise consistently, but also have the health advantages. So weight loss is not always critical. It depends on the source, if it's muscle, bone, fat, where the tissue is being changed. So lower exercise doses don't always mean an advantage in weight loss necessarily. So what that means is the 4 and 8 group, the 4 kilocalorie per kilogram per week group and the 8 group, they didn't really, they had lower exercise doses than the 12, because 4 and 8 are less than 12, but didn't always necessarily mean a significant change. So basically, the scientists did not measure a difference in weight loss for all 4 groups in 6 months of exercise training, so moderate exercise training. And so weight changes did not substantially modify waist circumference. And the reason they measured the correlation at 0.34, 11.6% of the variance. So it wasn't a substantial modification in waist circumference. And so just because you have different compensation and varied exercise doses and durations of exercise doesn't necessarily mean you're going to generate a correlation between the weight loss and waist circumference. So they may not always know why this happens, but they're trying to figure it out. And the weight control registry showed that people have lost weight and could sustain their weight loss. They did engage indefinitely in 45 minutes of exercise per day or 0.75 hours of moderate intensity exercise. So they were consistent, devoted, and dedicated, and then it worked. Individual people need to contrive strategies to prevent compensation. Compensation is negative. It's prescribed minus actual kilocalories of energy burn. So the USDA, U.S. Department of Agriculture, Dietary Guidelines, and Institute of Medicine recommended a 60-minute or 1 hour moderate exercise daily program. So engage in 60 minutes per day, not per week. And so the 4 and 8 kilocalorie per kilogram per week group performed 72 and 136 minutes of moderate physical activity per week, which is far less than the 420 that's recommended. So 60 minutes per day times 7 days per week, that's 420 minutes. So obviously they didn't necessarily engage in enough activity. And maybe it's genetics, maybe it's just attitude, but so they're trying to determine the exercise dose that inhibits weight gain. And they do know sedentary people won't achieve or accomplish 60 minutes or an hour a day of daily moderate exercise. They just don't like it, they hate it, so they won't do it. And so they're trying to figure out the dose because they won't engage in 60 minutes anyway. So ultimately, analyzing the study of sedentary, overweight, or obese, or postmenopausal women, there's no difference between actual and predicted weight loss, considering the 4 and 8 kilocalorie per kilogram per week groups who oxidized or expended 72 and 136 kilocalories each week for 6 months. And then again, the 12 kilocalorie per kilogram per week group engaged in 194 minutes. However, they only achieved 53.5 of the predicted weight loss. And we need to improve our understanding of the mechanisms involved in the dose of exercise while developing strategies for compensators. So compensation is a negative thing, remember, and we're trying to figure out strategies to prevent compensation. So they oxidize greater adipose body fat tissue, and that's it.